I'm honored to be joined by Suzyn Waldman, who's the color commentator for the Yankees on WFAN on the radio with John Sterling, and an absolute trailblazer, legend, and all around wonderful person in our field. We're so lucky to have you in sports, in baseball, in New York, just across the board. So thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Boy, and you know what? And I'm just thinking about the fact that, when I started this 35 years ago, those words never would have been said about me, ever, by anybody. It's just, it's almost like changing a paradigm. You come out the other side and all of a sudden you're a trailblazer, and 35 years before you just are ruining everything. It's amazing what happens with time, isn't it?
It really is. It really is. So, let's get into that a little bit. What was your mentality? For those who don't know, you were initially in theater, and what really led to that change, getting you onto this baseball side and participating in the media world?
Well, it was sports. And what had happened was I came to New York to be on Broadway, which I did, but the Broadway musicals that I came to New York to do, they're gone, they're not coming back. And I was getting older and I really had to find something else to do with my life. And I was always around sports. I mean, I had my own season ticket at Fenway Park when I was 3, and I grew up in sports. And it wasn't just baseball; it was baseball and the Celtics and the Bruins and Harvard football. And I was always in it. And I had a lot of friends with the Red Sox, and I was always around there. And when I was on the road in theater, how I used to spend my afternoons was go to the ballpark. And when I wanted to go to the ballpark, and I used to go and sing the national anthem. And this is the 70s and the 80s, and nobody realized it was a way to get on television. I just wanted to go to a ball game. And so I got to know an awful lot of people. And when I started thinking about changing careers, Ken Coleman, who at the time was the voice of the Boston Red Sox, said to me, there's this friend of mine, his name is John Shannon, and they're putting together something in New York, WFAN or something. It's going to be the first all sports radio station. He's got to meet you. It's not that I just decided to go into sports. I thought it was the only other thing that I could contribute to. I knew everything. I was a good talker, and I never saw any women. And I thought, oh, this will be cool. I bet I can do this. And I made a tape, and he hired me to be an update person. So I was the first voice on the air in WFAN. And after my first update, I hear the owner of the station yelling outside the door, get that smart aleck woman with the Boston accent off of my air. I want her off of my air. And I just kept going and going. And as soon as my voice hit the airwaves, there was all kinds of uproar. And then it turned into something else, Sarah. Then it turned into, nobody's going to tell me no. I know more than they do. I might not know radio yet, but I know how to perform. And I know more sports than most of these guys. And so I wasn't going to let this deter me. So I had some tough times coming in.
Where did that come from, that strength to just know that you did know more than them and that you knew what you were doing? How did you find the courage to stick to that?
Well, I spent 15 years trying to be on Broadway. I mean, I was in theater. I just always did. I guess it's always how you're brought up. I mean, my grandfather, who was the first one who took me to baseball games, told me when I was a baby, you're a princess and there's nothing you can't do. And my mother was, that's great. You can always do better. Just keep going. So somewhere in there between my grandfather and my mother is who I am. But it started really early. I always thought there was nothing I couldn't do because my grandfather told me that. So I believed it. And, maybe that was it. Also, I figured if I can make it in theater, I mean, in this business, I mean, come on, it's sports, we're not transplanting a kidney here.
Absolutely. And talk about two incredibly difficult industries, especially to break into. So that just makes you even more incredible that you've been at the pinnacle at some point in both of these.
Well,
Most people can speak to one, if that.
Oh, I won't say I was at the pinnacle in Broadway. I worked. I was a working actress, and I bought my house with one of my shows. But my mother had said, "Oh, this is really great. You picked the only thing harder than being on Broadway, and that's being a woman in sports. That's really terrific." So that's my 2 careers so far.
What was your mother's influence on you? I know that personally for me, my mother has been a huge influence on pursuing a job that is not, particularly dominated by women. And it's because she's such a strong model for me. And she's a scientist, which is an atypical career path. She's the only woman in the room in a lot of her meetings. Is there anyone in your life, your mother or anybody else, who had a similar kind of influence for you?
Well, I think it's the other way around, though. My mother was as brilliant a human being as I've ever met in my life, and she had a degree in chemistry from Simmons College, where I went to school. She graduated in '45, and she always wanted to be a pediatrician, specializing in children's cancer. And then the war came and was over, and she got married and had me, and that was the end of that, because that's women in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And finally, she went back and taught in the early 60s. But my mother was so brilliant. And if she had been stronger, maybe, or had a different choice in life, but she didn't think she had any other choice. So I think it was because my mother was never able to do the things that that I decided to do. And, I packed up from Boston and moved to New York all by myself, knew nobody when I was 20. So when I graduated from college and moved away, I think it's the other way around. It's that I looked at my mother and saw what she could have been, and I didn't want to disappoint her.
So you're living that out in a way, even though it's a different field than what she was interested in. You're kind of carrying that tradition on and actually, bringing it to fruition. I love that. I don't know. I just think that I think as women, we get asked a lot why we're interested in sports. I think we get asked that more than men do. And I think we get asked what led us to this point. And
Right.
so even though sometimes the question feels a little trite, I'm always interested in it from my perspective, just kind of putting my own personal life, and comparing that to others. So that's very interesting to me.
It, it,
Uh,
it's
yeah.
amazing to me. It's amazing to me. I remember a columnist in Boston once writing that when women started going into sports, this was much later, that unless you've slept with a baseball glove on under your pillow, you have no right to talk about it. Well, I mean, I'm sorry. I wasn't allowed to put a glove under my pillow. I knew I was not male, and I knew I was not going to be Ted Williams. I understood that. And I never understood that feeling that if you didn't play, you can't understand it. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of male obstetricians in this country that do very well delivering babies, and they've never had the experience of doing that. I've never understood that, and it's always bothered me. As I said before, we are not transplanting a kidney here.
Exactly. And I think that that is a sentiment that is changing. We see women in different roles, not just in the media, but also on the front office side and the coaching side, especially over the last few years, in positions that, didn't exist beforehand or certainly weren't open to women. I'm thinking of Bianca Smith and Alyssa Nakin and, also women in front office roles and analytics or whatever else it might be. So what is your sort of treetop view of that? I mean, where have we come in that time since you were that first voice we heard on WFAN in 1987 to today?
Well, truthfully, my first radio game was 1993. That's a very long time ago. And a lot of people don't go back that far, and I understand that. But after 93, 94, 95, I worked in television and it was still just just an awful ride and just an awful thing. And I guess if I'm standing from above, I see that there are more, but quite frankly, full time, every game, it's still just me. There are 60 jobs, right? There's 30 teams and a crew of 2 in the radio. There's one woman. It's still me. I know that there are more Melanie Newman and Jenny Kavner. They do more games. They do some games, but it's not the same. 93 to me is a very, very long time ago. I'm really glad that all that is starting to happen, but to me, it's been too long. And you know what, Sarah, I don't see a lot of change in the attitude. I'm sorry, I don't. I just don't. I still think that there's an 18-year-old intern somewhere that thinks that they know more than you or me or any other woman just because they're male. I see who gets assignments. I see who gets called to talk about a certain subject. That's not That's not in the public eye. That's not, the things that we look at that are going on now. That's not harassment. That's not anything. That's women in the workplace still getting passed over. Oh, no, no, we can't have that woman talk about this sports. Let's call the guy. And women still get called just to talk about women's issues, quote unquote. It's not a women's issue, by the way, guys. Women in the workplace is not a women's issue. It's a workplace issue. And the sooner everybody gets along with that, it's terrific. You just named wonderful women, wonderful women. I met Kim Ang in 1998. I knew she was a star then. Derek Jeter knew she was a star then. And when did she get her job? How many years was it? A long time ago. A long time ago. So for me, it's not moving nearly as fast. And the women, we could count them on both hands, right?
Definitely. I think that we all want to see a moment where there isn't a story every time a woman gets hired into a different role. I know that that's something I talk about with my friends frequently. It's incredible to hear these women's stories, whether they're getting hired in a front office or a coaching job. But I think that real progress, and really the point that I want to see us get to, is where that's not a story and we don't know her whole life story. She's just another person getting hired in a press release, right?
That's exactly right. And I actually said that. Somebody called me from the Baltimore Sun when wonderful Melanie Newman got hired. And out of my mouth came, well, of course I'll talk about her, but wouldn't it be wonderful that if a woman got hired and she wasn't considered a novelty act and you didn't have to call me and ask what I thought about it? It's an amazing thing. And I know it takes a long time. I understand, but it shouldn't. I mean, this is silly. And it's more, we can concentrate on women that are on camera or behind a microphone, but it's the other thing that bothers me. It's who is making news assignments and who gets assigned to which and who gets called to do what story. That's the thing that is so inequitable. It's still unbelievable. It could be 1980 as far as I'm concerned, the way I see how that's being run.
So what's next? How do we change that? And of course, I want to be clear. I don't think that changing this is necessarily on us as women. I think that that's a conversation that's been going on a lot recently, but just from your perspective, because you have such invaluable perspective, what do you think comes next and how do we get to that point?
Well, we just keep going. And I don't know when it's going to happen. We just keep going. But you're right about one thing. Every time a woman gets in the news, it is not your responsibility or my responsibility to speak for every woman that either gets something or something happens to them. And by the way, it is not up to us to change it. It's up to us to keep going. And that changes it, which is very different than us changing it. And every time somebody gets hired in a front office, and every time someone does it. I read yesterday, somebody wrote an article about how wonderful a job Kim Ang is doing. Well, of course she is, but she's been there 5 minutes, and we haven't even started the season yet. I don't see other new general managers getting report cards every 4 weeks. I mean, it just doesn't work like that. But that is going to happen. She understands it. She's got the personality for it. She has the strength for it, as do the other women that are in our business. There's nobody stronger than the assistant general manager of the New York Yankees, Jean Afterman. I mean, she knows exactly what she's doing, and she has a different way of approaching it. She is where she is. No, she doesn't necessarily want to be a general manager, but she knows. You also have to know who you are, what you can do, and where you can contribute. And I think
absolutely.
And you also have to know what you don't want to do and what you are not good at. And so find whatever that is and just keep going. Listen, I went on 200 commercial auditions before I got my first commercial. I mean, that's the world. And that's something that is never going to change. And I think people want to make this a story, how far we've come. Maybe to you guys it is, not to me, not to me. Not to me, who started in 1987. Not to me, who's one of my best friends is Melissa Lutke, who in the 70s and 80s. And if you don't know who Melissa Lutke is, everybody listening, go look her up, because she's changed the sport for everybody. It's yesterday to me. It's yesterday to me that I was spit at, that I had my own police detail at Yankee Stadium, where guys at WFAN took my tapes and took words out of them so I'd sound like a moron. it's 5 minutes ago that this all happened to me. And if you guys haven't gone through it, God bless you. But it's still out there. Trust me, it's just a little different now. Now I guess they do it in cyberspace.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the change that I see, and of course my perspective is not nearly as broad, and I have only been doing this for a couple of years, especially in comparison, but the change that I see is just representation. I do think that that matters a lot. I think that even for myself growing up, knowing I wanted to talk about or write about baseball for a living, I knew who you were. I grew up in New York City, and knowing that there was a woman doing that was just opened up my world, and I do think that I had a supportive family that would have pushed me to do what I wanted to do regardless. But knowing that this was happening, I think was a really big motivating factor. And seeing women now on the coaching side in ways that they haven't been before, in the front office, working in analytics, Maggie O'Hara with the Tigers is someone who I think of. She does analytics. She does stuff that a lot of men can't do, that a lot of humans can't do. I don't care what gender they are. And I just think that there are little girls who are 7 or 8 years old and see these things, and it does change what they think is possible. So even if the treatment still has some ways to go, I do think that there is a broader view of what women can do in baseball and in sports in general.
Well, I do know that on the minor league level, and the first time these women took a picture of themselves and sent it to me, I just started to cry. There was a picture of minor league women, and they were at the winter meetings, I believe, and there were 6 of them, I think, and I know most of them, and they were standing together, and all these wonderful women, they have jobs, and they're in the minor leagues, and they're working on their craft, and it's not going to be a fluke. Oh, let's get this girl. Let's get this girl. Let's try it like they did in the 60s. And, people like Mary Shane, who never had a shot, and people that were on the air as let's do it as a gimmick. Isn't that going to be good? And eventually they're gone and they don't get hired full time. But I can name you 7 or 8 women pretty much off the top of my head who are going to be there. And and they're at AA and at A ball and starting to go into AAA. There's so many of them, and they've got it all planned out. I never had a plan. I just kept going with my machete through the Amazon. I mean, that's because there was no path. And now I see it there, and it's terrific to watch. I got to tell you, I think about that. The first time I ever did play-by-play for a WNBA game, it was way back when they were still on Lifetime. And I walked into that arena in Washington, and it was sold out. And little girls, I cry a lot. So it was crying, little girls with paint on their faces and the standing for autographs, and the Washington t-shirts on, and some were with their fathers, but most were with their mothers. And I thought it was just the most magnificent thing I'd ever seen. That's a long time ago. Those little girls are now grown up, and trust me, I know their lives have changed because of the WNBA and because they were allowed to stand in line and get an autograph from a woman and look up the way I used to look up at Ted Williams. I saw a little girl looking up at a guard named Tisha Pinacheri, and I just started to cry and now I think about that little girl. Where is she? What did she do? But I bet her life was changed because she was treated like a person, and she saw someone that she could be when she grew up.
Oh my gosh, I had chills with you telling that story. I mean, I just think that that's the power of sports, and especially with women's sports for sure. But I just think any of these roles, it's really seeing yourself just changes everything, and being able to imagine it.
And you don't have to be in the sports arena. It's that because that little girl saw her, who knows what she became? Maybe because she had confidence. Maybe she gave her confidence to be the CEO of a company. I don't know. I know that in '94, I believe it was, when I was on the baseball network, it was the first woman ever to do a national TV game. I was on about 50 shows. I mean, I sat in a room and cameras were on me, and I was sitting there, and I was on some show in Philadelphia, and one of the co-hosts was an ex-Eagle, a football player. And we were talking, and he came out and he said, Suzyn, I don't like you on the air. I don't like women in sports. But last night, I was sitting there and I was watching my 10-year-old daughter, and she was watching you. And I looked at her and I thought to myself, this is something she's never going to know she can't do, because there you are. And this is a guy who didn't like me. He hated my voice. He hated my accent. And, he said he didn't like me, but it made an impression. I wonder where his little girl is right now. She's probably doing something wonderful too.
Definitely. That's so incredible. And at a certain point, this isn't even a sports conversation. To what you're saying, it's where women are in the world compared to 50, 60, 70 years ago. And I do think that regardless of it's whether it's sports, whether it's having a female vice president or whatever else it is, I just think that we have continuous examples and role models of women doing strong things that I don't think we were thinking about 50 or 60 years ago.
And it's not even 50 or 60 years ago. I mean, it's just, it's, I mean, I think it's taken too long from my looking at my overview, but the last maybe 10 years has happened very quickly, because that this didn't happen overnight. And it's a women in the workplace issue. It's not a woman in sports issue. And the more we try and narrow it down, it's everywhere. And I think about my mother, and she was not really given a choice. Now you have the choice. If you don't want to do this, and if you don't want to be in the workplace, you don't have to. That's what this all started about 50 years ago. You don't have to, but it should be your choice, and you shouldn't be demeaned because you want to do something that's maybe a little different. And that's maybe, maybe just think of the difference when, and a lot of people don't remember when Geraldine Ferraro ran for vice president. I do. I mean, it was awful what they said about her. And then move a little forward, there was that side about Hillary Clinton too, and trying to be president. And now we've come further. And now you look, and there is someone up there, and Kamala Harris is doing that. To me, it's happened very quickly, but has taken much too long.
I think that's a good way to put it, that I certainly understand what you're saying, that it has taken too long. And I look at this, and at a certain point in my life, I didn't even understand that people would think a woman being in sports was atypical, because that's just not how I was raised. That's not the household that I was aware of. So if you look at it on the broad scale, I certainly see that it's taken too long to get here. But I like what you're saying about it's happened very quickly over the last 10 years. What do you think has really caused that across the board, sports and just the world?
I think women doing what they want to do, not being afraid, and succeeding. And what always bothered me, I know that over not lately, but what I saw for years was women being set up to fail. And there were a couple of jobs that I was set up to fail, and I knew it, but I couldn't do anything about it. You just keep going. I mean, in 1988, I was fired along with people because I was female. They shouldn't have done that, because you can't fire all the women off the air, and I sued them. So it was,
Okay.
that's how I'm still here. They didn't want any part of that. But it's that kind of attitude that because women were given a chance because of the laws, then you become successful. And it's like now I don't know. I mean, I walk into the Yankee clubhouse, if we ever get back there again, it's like I'm a piece of furniture. I mean, I've been there forever. And, I've always thought players are not stupid, and they will know when you open your mouth, whether you know what you're talking about or you don't know what you're talking about. They don't have to be told, well, she's female, she doesn't. They'll let you know. If you ask a stupid question, you'll get a look, and they'll tell everybody else. But if you know what you're doing, eventually just keep going. Just keep going, because eventually it stops. Now, if you're in there for other reasons, then it's not going to stop. But it's proving yourself, and because you are hired, someone else will get hired. I got to tell you, the first time I was ever on one of the shows on MLB Network, I walked into the pre-show meeting. There wasn't another female face. Now I walk in there. There are. There are. 5 years ago, you wouldn't have been interviewing me. Brian Kenny would have been interviewing me, or somebody like that. And I love Brian, sorry. But you know what I mean? It's a totally different thing. It's wonderful to walk into a room where they're talking about what's going to be on the show and who's going to call in and all that stuff. And there are female faces in there. And also, unlike you, I never knew I didn't know about sports. My mother knew, my aunts knew. Everybody, I'd sat in Fenway Park with Cardinal Cushing used to bring the nuns. I remember they knew. I never knew I wasn't supposed to know sports until I wanted to make a living in it. And then it was, well, sorry, honey. Honey was a good one back then. Yeah. Sorry, honey.
No.
Anyway, just keep going. It all works out. And I have a saying that I use, and it's up on my wall somewhere. There was an actress named Ruth Gordon, and before she was in Harold and Maude, she was a very famous young actress, and she always, this is about Broadway, but I always have used it in everything. There are no failures on Broadway, just people that give up too soon. And I've always thought that, just keep going. Maybe tomorrow someone will call and say, we need someone to do this. You want to do it? And don't ever say no. Never. Make yourself indispensable. Do whatever they ask. Just keep going. Because eventually someone will notice. And eventually it will not be a novelty act when I'm sitting in a room with other women breaking down stats and, somebody's whip. Or it's eventually you'll go in and there'll be women and there'll be men and no one will think anything about it. Hopefully.
Definitely. That's perfect advice. I was going to ask if you had any for women who are the only one in the room or whatever else it might be, but I think you summed it up. But I really like what you said about, knowledge. I mean, if it is clear that you're competent and it's clear that you know what you're talking about, that is going to break most barriers, maybe not in the first second, but within those first 5 minutes. And unless it's someone who is just incredibly set in their ways. But I think that at the point we're at, young players, these are players who their school classes were 50-50 gender-wise, right? I mean, we're not talking about players who were not dealing with women every step of the way throughout their schooling and career to this point. So I do think that once you know what whip is or whatever it is that you're talking about, fastball, slider, whatever it might be, I do think that it's a universal language, and that's kind of just about sports in general, but certainly with baseball.
I think that it's always been, women have always been, you assume that a woman doesn't know. And when I had first started, and this is something that now I see when I walk into a clubhouse, there's a room full of women. I mean, everywhere in every sport. But when I first started, it was me with the Yankees and a wonderful woman named Suzyn Waldman. She's the one that Dave Kingman sent the rat to. And she was in Oakland. And I used to say to her, the only time I'm ever totally comfortable is when the Yankees are playing the A's. And that was the Bash brothers. That was Ricky and Connie Lansford and that great team, because they expected to see a woman every day. And the Yankees expected to see a woman every day. And the only time the two of us ever totally relaxed is when the two teams were playing each other. And I think that's gone. And that is progress. Right? That's terrific when that happens. But just for anybody out there, if you think you have something to contribute to this game, just keep going. Just keep going. And, don't try and be somebody else. Don't try and keep up with somebody else that's done something. Be you. Keep going at it, and somebody's going to notice. I promise you. If you've got something to contribute, someone will notice. There's a lot of people out there, a lot of people that want to do a lot of good and help. And it's not just changing things. It's for the betterment of everybody, not just the sport. I mean, why not have a different point of view? And that's another thing. Why is it? What's a woman's point of view? I have a point of view about a lot of things. Does it come from me because I'm a woman? I don't think so. They're my opinions, and I happen to be female. So maybe that'll stop. What's a woman's view on this? Is if you and I speak to every woman in this country.
Spokesperson,
Yeah.
Well, I could talk to you all day, and I would love to, but I think that that's really a wonderful, inspiring note to end on. So I just want to thank you again so much for taking the time and chatting with us. Obviously, the template here, the reason we're having this conversation is Women's History Month, but we would do this every month. I would do this every week, every day if that were allowed. So it's just a wonderful time to talk. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, and thank you very much for having me.